The kid lifted the rifle out of the canvas case the way a man might lift a piece of scrap iron. By the middle of the barrel, with two careless fingers, the muzzle pointed at the deer head on the back wall, the butt of the stock dragging across the glass counter with a slow, hollow scrape. He held it out at arm's length, squinted at it the way a man squints at something he's already decided is worthless, and let out a single short breath through his nose that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh. Then he set it back down on the glass and grinned, all teeth and gum, and said the line he had been rehearsing in his head from the moment the old man walked through the door. $20, the kid said. $20 for the wood, man. Best I can do. Vernon Whitaker stood on the other side of the counter, 81 years old, the faded canvas John Deere ball cap his late wife June had bought him at the dealer in Hannibal in the spring of 2009, pulled low over silver-white hair, sharp pale blue eyes behind silver wire-rimmed glasses, the long canvas rifle case still half-zipped at his hip, and watched a 23-year-old in a dark green polo with a crooked name tag reading Tucker look at his father's rifle and see $20 worth of old wood and old metal. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. Vernon Whitaker had not raised his voice in 60 years, not once, not even on the morning in November of 2010, when the doctor at St. Luke's came out of the small white room with his hands folded and told him about the stroke and what it meant. He had a way of standing very still when the world was making a mistake, and he was standing very still now, both hands resting flat on the cool glass on either side of the rifle. His weathered forearms tanned the color of old saddle leather, where the cuffs of the chambray flannel were rolled to the elbow. "It belonged to my father," Vernon said, quiet, the way a man says a fact that doesn't need defending. "He carried it home from France in 1919. Tucker shrugged. The shrug rolled up through his lanky shoulders and into his shaggy, sandy blonde hair and out the top of his head. He glanced down at the rifle, at the long blued barrel and the dark walnut stock and the worn leather sling, and then he glanced past Vernon at the front door, where nobody was coming in, and then he glanced down at his phone, which was face up on the counter beside the cash register and which had not lit up in 11 minutes. "Yeah," he said. "Look, my man, I'm sure it did. But everybody's grandpa was in a war. I get like 4 of these a month. Old bolt action, banged up wood, no papers, no box, no nothing. $20 is the wood. The metal's pitted. I can't move it. I'm doing you a favor, honestly." He threw his head back when he said the word favor. He threw his head back the way young men throw their heads back when they are about to laugh at something that is already funny in their own minds before anyone else has heard the joke. And the laugh came out of him in a single sharp bark that bounced off the glass cases and the dozens of guitars hanging in 3 rows on the back wall behind him, and the glass eye of the 8-point whitetail buck mounted between the neon Pabst sign and the neon Budweiser sign. His hands came down palms flat on the counter on either side of the rifle. The fluorescent overhead light made the crooked plastic name tag on his polo flash for a second. Vernon Whitaker did not move. He did not move because he had been a man for 81 years, and he knew the difference between a fight worth having and a fight not worth having, and this was not, in this moment, on this Tuesday afternoon in a pawn shop on the south side of a small Missouri river town, a fight worth having. He simply slid the rifle back across the glass with the pads of his fingers, very gently, the way a man slides a sleeping cat off his lap, and he said, "I think I'll keep it then." "Cool," Tucker said. "Cool, cool, cool. Door's right there." He was already looking back at his phone when Vernon picked the rifle up and laid it back into the long canvas case, when Vernon zipped the case closed with one slow pull, when Vernon settled the canvas strap over his right shoulder and turned for the door. The little brass bell over the door rang once, and the late afternoon Missouri sunlight came in for half a second, warm and gold against the cool fluorescent green of the shop, and then the door closed and the bell rang once more, and Tucker did not look up. Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. The rifle Vernon Whitaker had just zipped back into a faded canvas case and carried out the front door of Burlington Pawn and Loan was a presentation-grade Springfield model 1903 bolt-action, serial number stamped 314602 on the receiver, hand-finished in the spring of 1917 at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts by a master stocker named Albin Carlson, presented 6 months later to Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Tull of the 35th Infantry Division on the eve of the regiment's deployment to France, and carried by Vernon's father, Sergeant Cyrus Whitaker, through the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the autumn of 1918. It was one of fewer than 30 such rifles ever finished to that grade. The walnut stock had been hand-selected from a single billet of Tennessee black walnut, cured for 7 years. The trigger group had been hand-stoned by Carlson himself. The serial number was on file at the Springfield Armory National Historic Site Museum in Massachusetts under a small index card that had read, since 1962, "Presumed Lost, France." And at the most recent Rock Island Auction Company sale of a comparable presentation-grade pre-1918 Springfield with documented regimental provenance, the hammer had come down at $92,000. But Tucker did not know any of that. Tucker did not know that the carved initials on the underside of the walnut stock, 3 small block letters, FJT, cut into the wood with the point of a bayonet on a quiet afternoon in a billet outside the village of Romagne-sous-Montfaucon in the second week of October 1918, were the initials of Frederick James Tull, the lieutenant colonel who had been killed 3 days earlier by shrapnel from a German 77mm shell that landed too close to the regimental command post. Tucker did not know that Cyrus Whitaker, who had been Tull's runner, had carved those initials himself with his own hand at the request of the surviving officers as a kind of quiet vow to bring the rifle home and keep it. Tucker did not know that there was a second inscription cut deeper on the inside curve of the buttplate in tiny block letters that you had to angle the stock against the light to read 35th Infantry Division, FJT, KIA, October 7th, 1918. Tucker had not turned the rifle over. Tucker had not opened the buttplate. Tucker had not run a thumbnail along the underside of the stock or held the wood up to the fluorescent light. Tucker had not done any of the things a man would have to do to know what he was holding. He had lifted it by the middle of the barrel and called it $20 and tossed his head back and laughed. It started the way these things start, with a quiet man named Cyrus Whitaker, who was born on a tenant farm outside the town of Hannibal, Missouri, in the spring of 1894, the second of 7 children in a household that owned 3 things of value: a milking cow named Bess, a single-shot .22 squirrel rifle, and a Bible with the family tree written into the front leaf in 3 different hands. Cyrus Whitaker grew up the way farm boys grew up in Missouri at the turn of the century. He learned to shoot squirrels for the supper pot before he was 9. He learned to drive a mule team before he was 12. He learned to read the weather off the ridgeline before he was 15, and he left the farm for the first time in his life on the 3rd of April, 1917, 3 days after President Wilson signed the declaration of war against the German Empire, when he walked 22 miles to the recruiting office in Hannibal and put his name down for the United States Army. He was 23 years old. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He weighed 152 pounds. The recruiting sergeant wrote down the color of his eyes as pale blue and the color of his hair as light brown and the condition of his teeth as good. He was assigned to Company H of the 138th Infantry Regiment, 35th Infantry Division, and he shipped out for France in the spring of 1918 on the troop transport USS Leviathan, and he came home 14 months later on a different ship and a different dock in a different season, with a long-blued bolt-action rifle wrapped in oilcloth in his sea bag and a folded letter from a captain named Earl Pruitt in the breast pocket of his uniform that explained in small, careful handwriting how the rifle had come to him and why he was to keep it. Sergeant Cyrus Whitaker had been the personal runner for Lieutenant Colonel Frederick James Tull from the second week of August 1918 until the morning of the 7th of October, when a German shell had landed in the road behind the regimental command post, and Tull had died, conscious, on a stretcher, of a shrapnel wound through the chest. The rifle had been Tull's. Tull had been given the rifle as a presentation piece by his fellow officers at Camp Doniphan in Oklahoma in the autumn of 1917, a gift to mark the regiment's deployment overseas. The rifle had been finished for him by name and serial number at the Springfield Armory by a master stocker named Albin Carlson, who had been finishing presentation rifles for officers and dignitaries since 1893 and who finished, on average, 4 such rifles a year. Tull had carried it across France for 10 weeks. Cyrus Whitaker had carried it across France for 14 months after that, all the way home. He kept it in the rafters of the milking barn, wrapped in a square of oilcloth from the Standard Oil Company, on a flatboard he had nailed across 2 crossbeams above the cow stalls, where the heat of the cattle in the winter and the breath of the hay in the summer kept the wood from cracking. He took it down twice a year, on the 7th of October and on the 11th of November, and he wiped it down with a soft cotton patch and a few drops of light machine oil, and he sat on a milking stool in the barn, and he held it across his lap, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't cry. Then he wrapped it back up, and he put it back on the board, and he went back to the house, and he ate his supper. He did this every year for 48 years. In the spring of 1947, he married a quiet woman named Hazel Cosgrove from over by Palmyra, and in the winter of 1948, they had a son they named Vernon, and in the spring of 1962, he sat his 14-year-old boy down on the same milking stool in the same barn, and he climbed up on a wooden ladder, and he took down the oilcloth bundle for the first time outside of the 7th of October and the 11th of November, and he unwrapped it on a clean square of butcher paper on the dirt floor of the barn, and he showed his son the rifle, and he told him the story of Lieutenant Colonel Frederick James Tull and the morning of the 7th of October and the carving of the initials in the stock and the inscription on the inside of the buttplate, and he told the boy that the rifle was not a thing to sell and not a thing to shoot, that the rifle was a kind of promise, and that promises did not have a price. Vernon Whitaker, who had been 14 years old in the spring of 1962, who had sat on a milking stool on the dirt floor of his father's barn and listened to a story about a man named Frederick James Tull, who had died in a road in France 4 years before he was born, had remembered every word of it for 67 years. His father had died in the autumn of 1971 of a heart attack in the lower 40, a clean and quiet death at the age of 77, and the rifle had passed to Vernon, and Vernon had kept it on the same flatboard across the same 2 crossbeams in the same barn, wrapped in a fresh square of oilcloth from the Sears Roebuck catalog for the next 54 years. He had taken it down twice a year on the same 2 days. He had wiped it down with the same kind of soft cotton patch and the same kind of light machine oil. He had sat on the same milking stool, and he had held it across his lap, and he had not said anything, and he had not cried. Then he had wrapped it back up and put it back on the board and gone back to the house, where June had been waiting with supper for 43 years. And then for 10 years after the stroke he had eaten supper alone. And then this past June, in the warm part of summer when the wheat was high in the lower 40, his granddaughter Mara had driven down from St. Louis for a long weekend and had sat on the front porch with him after supper and had said, very gently, the words that had brought him 4 months later to the glass counter of Burlington Pawn and Loan on a Tuesday afternoon in October. "Grandpa," Mara had said, "I think you should get it appraised, not to sell, just so we know." She was 29 years old. She worked in a public library in St. Louis. She had been the one who found, in a footlocker in the attic of the farmhouse the previous Christmas, a folded envelope containing a small cardstock photograph of a young soldier in a peaked overseas cap and a cracked leather Sam Brown belt, a man with the same pale blue eyes Vernon and his father had both had, sitting on a French farm wall with a long bolt-action rifle across his knees. On the back of the photograph, in faded brown ink, someone had written, "Cyrus, France, May 1919, coming home." And beside the photograph, folded into the same envelope, had been a typewritten letter on creased onion skin paper, signed by a Captain Earl Pruitt, dated the 12th of November 1918, that began, "Sergeant Whitaker, in accordance with the wishes of the surviving officers of the regimental staff, you are to retain custody of the rifle of the late Lieutenant Colonel Tull." Mara had photographed the letter on her phone and shown it to a friend at the Missouri Historical Society, and the friend had shown it to a friend at the Springfield Armory National Historic Site Museum in Massachusetts, and someone at Springfield had sent back 2 months later a polite email asking whether the rifle still existed and whether it might be possible to inspect it. The email had used the phrase "presumed lost in France" in 1962. Mara had read the email 3 times, and then she had called Vernon on a Tuesday evening in September, and she had said, "Grandpa, I think we need to take this serious." Vernon Whitaker did not own a computer. Vernon Whitaker did not have an email address. Vernon Whitaker had agreed to bring the rifle to a man Mara's friend at the Historical Society had recommended, a quiet older gunsmith and museum curator named Dr. Hollis Ashby, 62 years old, who ran the firearms wing of the State University Museum 2.5 hours away by car, and who would be in the Rivertown that Tuesday for an unrelated estate appraisal and could meet Vernon at the Burlington Pawn and Loan parking lot at 3 in the afternoon. Vernon, being a man of his generation and his grain, had not wanted to make the curator wait. He had arrived at the pawn shop a full 45 minutes early. He had carried the rifle in through the front door because it had begun, very lightly, to rain. He had set the canvas case on the glass counter with the polite intention of waiting inside, out of the weather. The boy behind the counter, the one whose crooked plastic name tag read Tucker, had glanced up from his phone and seen the rifle case and grinned the way a kid grins when he thinks easy money has just walked through the door. The bell over the front door of Burlington Pawn and Loan rang for the second time that afternoon at 12 minutes past 3. The man who came in was 62 years old, and he was carrying a small leather attaché case and a folded black umbrella that was wet to the handle. He had neatly groomed silver-gray hair parted on the left side, and he wore tortoiseshell rectangular glasses and a soft brown and charcoal herringbone tweed sport coat over a cream button-down shirt and a navy knit tie, and around his neck on a fine brass chain hung a small brass jeweler's loupe that swung quietly against the buttons of his coat as he walked. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the shop the way a man who has spent 40 years in museums looks around any room, slowly, taking inventory, without making a show of it. His eyes found Vernon, who was standing in the middle of the shop with the long canvas rifle case in both hands and a quiet, patient expression on his face, and his eyes found the kid behind the counter who had glanced up at the bell and was now looking at the tweed sport coat and the brass loupe with the faint, puzzled expression of a young man who is trying to place a face he has never seen. "Mr. Whitaker?" the curator said. "Dr. Ashby," Vernon said. "Sorry to bring you out in the rain." "Not at all," the curator said. "May I see it?" Vernon set the canvas case back down on the glass counter, very gently, and he unzipped it the rest of the way, and he laid the rifle out on the glass between them. Tucker, who had been about to look back down at his phone, did not look back down at his phone. Tucker, who had been about to say something dismissive to the older gentleman in the tweed coat, did not say anything dismissive. Tucker stood very still behind the counter with his hands resting palms down on the glass on either side of the rifle, the way they had been resting 15 minutes earlier when he had laughed, and he watched. Dr. Hollis Ashby did not pick the rifle up. Dr. Hollis Ashby took 2 slow steps around the end of the counter, so he was standing on the same side of the glass as the rifle, and then he leaned forward with both hands behind his back, the way a man leans forward over a museum case, and he looked at it. He looked at the long blued barrel. He looked at the hand-stoned bolt. He looked at the worn leather sling. He looked at the dark, close-grained walnut of the stock, and then he straightened up, and he reached very slowly into the inner pocket of his tweed coat, and he took out a pair of thin white cotton gloves, and he put them on, one finger at a time. He picked the rifle up. He picked it up the way a man picks up a sleeping infant, by the small of the stock and the underside of the forend, with the muzzle angled down toward the floor and well away from any human being in the room. And he turned it over in his cotton-gloved hands, and he angled the underside of the stock to catch the cool fluorescent light, and he found, just forward of the trigger guard, 3 small block letters cut deep into the walnut. FJT. He held the loupe to his eye on its brass chain, and he leaned in close. He did not say anything. The shop was very quiet. The neon Pobst sign behind Tucker buzzed very softly, on its glass tube. Somewhere out on the rain-wet street, a car went by. Then Dr. Ashby turned the rifle over again, and he very gently unscrewed the steel butt plate from the heel of the stock with the small screwdriver he had taken from the inside pocket of his tweed coat, and he laid the butt plate face down on a clean white cotton handkerchief he had unfolded on the glass counter, and he angled the inside curve of the butt plate toward the light, and he read, in tiny block letters cut into the brass, 35th Infantry Division, FJT, KIA, 7th of October, 1918. He set the butt plate down on the handkerchief. He took off his glasses with one cotton-gloved hand. He pinched the bridge of his nose between the thumb and the forefinger of his other hand. He stood that way for the better part of a half a minute, the long Springfield rifle balanced across his left forearm, the butt plate face down on a white cotton handkerchief on the glass beside him, the brass loop swinging quietly against the buttons of his coat, and he didn't say anything at all. Then he put his glasses back on, and he turned the rifle one more time so the receiver caught the light, and he read the serial number stamped into the steel, 31462. And he closed his eyes for a second, and he opened them, and he looked up at Vernon Whitaker, and he said, very quietly, "Mr. Whitaker, do you know what this is?" It was not a question. Vernon, who was 81 years old, and who had been raised by a quiet man, and who had married a quiet woman, and who had spent a lifetime not raising his voice, said, "I know whose it was. My father carried it home. The rest I don't pretend to know." Dr. Ashby nodded. He set the rifle, very gently, back down on the canvas case. He removed his cotton gloves, finger by finger, and folded them, and put them back inside the inner pocket of his tweed coat. Then he took out his leather-bound notebook, and he opened it to a clean page, and he uncapped a slim black fountain pen, and he wrote down the serial number and the date and the names, Cyrus Whitaker, Frederick James Tull, Albin Carlson, in a small, careful hand. And then he looked up at Vernon, and he said the sentence the boy behind the counter would think about, on and off, for the rest of that Tuesday afternoon and the long Tuesday evening that followed, and the rest of his 23rd year and quite a lot of the years that came after. "Mr. Whitaker," the curator said, "this is a presentation-grade Springfield model 1903, finished by hand at the Springfield Armory in the spring of 1917 by a master stocker named Albin Carlson, presented to Lieutenant Colonel Frederick James Tull of the 35th Infantry Division at Camp Doniphan, Oklahoma, in the autumn of 1917. Fewer than 30 such rifles were ever finished to this grade. This particular rifle has been listed on the Springfield Armory Museum's Index of Presentation Arms as presumed lost in France since 1962. With the inscriptions, with the regimental provenance, with the documented chain of custody from your father forward. And assuming you can produce the letter from Captain Pruitt, which I am told you have, this rifle at auction would conservatively bring between $72,000 and $95,000. Tucker, behind the counter, made a small sound. It was not a laugh. It was a very small sound, somewhere between a breath and a word, and it came out of him before he had decided whether to make it. His hands were still flat on the glass. The crooked plastic name tag on his polo had gone a little crookeder. He was looking at the rifle, and then he was looking at Vernon, and then he was looking at the curator, and then he was looking at the rifle again, the way a man looks back and forth between a thing he has just done and a thing he is just beginning to understand he has done. Vernon Whitaker did not look at Tucker. Vernon Whitaker looked at the curator. He took off his John Deere cap with his right hand, and he held it against his chest, the way a man holds his hat when something is being said that requires a hat to be off, and he said, "Thank you, Dr. Ashby. I appreciate you coming out." "Mr. Whitaker," the curator said, and his voice was very gentle, "I have to ask, are you intending to sell?" Vernon Whitaker put his cap back on his head. He looked down at the rifle on the glass counter. He looked at the small block letters carved into the underside of the walnut stock, FJT, the initials a quiet sergeant from a Missouri tenant farm had cut into a piece of Tennessee black walnut with the point of a bayonet in a billet outside Romain-sous-Montfaucon in the second week of October 1918. He thought of his father, sitting on a milking stool in a barn in the autumn of 1971, 3 weeks before the heart attack in the lower 40, holding the rifle across his knees and saying, very quietly, "It's not for selling, Vern. You understand?" "No, sir," Vernon Whitaker said. "I am not." Dr. Ashby smiled, very small, and he nodded once. He said, "If you would consider loaning it, the museum would treat it as if it were our own, with your name on the placard, with your father's name, with Lieutenant Colonel Tull's. We would build the case for it next spring." Vernon thought about that. He looked at the rifle on the glass. He thought about the barn rafters and the oilcloth and the milking stool and the 7th of October and the 11th of November, and he thought about Mara, who was 29 years old and who worked in a public library and who had a young son of her own named Cyrus, after the great-great-grandfather he would never meet, and he thought about the boy named Cyrus growing up in St. Louis, and one day perhaps walking into a museum 2.5 hours from home and seeing his great-great-grandfather's name on a small brass placard under a long blued bolt-action rifle in a glass case, and he said, very quietly, "I'll think on it. I expect we will." Dr. Ashby nodded again. He gathered the butt plate from the white cotton handkerchief and the small screwdriver, and he reattached the butt plate to the heel of the stock with 4 small careful turns of the screwdriver, and he laid the rifle back into the canvas case, and he zipped the case the rest of the way shut. He shook Vernon's hand. He thanked him. He walked back out the front door of Burlington Pawn and Loan into the soft October rain with his folded black umbrella and his small leather attaché case, and the brass bell over the door rang once, and then once more, and then the shop was very quiet. Tucker was still standing behind the counter with his hands flat on the glass. Vernon Whitaker looked at him for the first time since he had come back into the shop. He did not look at him with anger. He did not look at him with satisfaction. He looked at him the way a man looks at a young man who has just been handed, by chance and by his own mouth, a kind of small private lesson that the young man was going to have to carry around inside himself for a long time, and he picked up the canvas case, and he settled the strap over his right shoulder, and he tipped his cap, and he said, "Have a good evening, son." Then he walked out of the pawn shop into the soft October rain. The kid behind the counter, Tucker by the crooked name tag, did not say anything for a long time. He looked at the empty glass where the rifle had been. He looked at the front door. He looked at his phone, which had not lit up in 26 minutes. He looked at the 8-point whitetail mounted between the neon Pabst sign and the neon Budweiser sign, and the deer looked back at him with one glass eye, and the deer did not say anything either. He thought, for the first time in his 23 years, about the things he didn't know. The Whistle Stop Diner sat on the north end of Front Street, 3 blocks from the river, in a narrow brick building that had been a feed store in 1908 and a barber shop in 1934 and a diner since the spring of 1957, with a long formica counter and red vinyl stools and a row of green booths along the front windows. The morning fog off the river had not quite burned off when Vernon Whitaker pushed the front door open at 20 after 7 on the Wednesday morning after his trip to Burlington Pawn and Loan, and the bell over the diner door rang, and Junior and Walter, who had been sitting in the second booth from the door since 6:55, looked up from their coffee at the same moment and grinned the same grin. "Well," Junior said, "look who finally decided to grace us." "Coffee's cold," Walter said, "on account of waiting." "It is not," Junior said. "Becky just topped me up." Vernon eased himself down into the booth across from them, the long canvas rifle case set carefully beside him on the green vinyl of the bench seat, and Becky, the morning waitress, came over with a heavy white mug in the pot, and she filled the mug to the brim without being asked, and Vernon nodded his thanks, and Becky went back to the counter. Junior, 74 years old, broad in the shoulders, faded red plaid flannel over a white t-shirt, faded green Boone County Co-op cap pulled low over a face like a worn leather glove, leaned forward with both forearms on the formica and said, "Well, did you take it down to the man?" Vernon took a slow sip of black coffee. He set the mug down on the table. He looked across the booth at Junior, and then at Walter, 76 years old, slim, neatly cut silver gray hair, soft pale blue lamb's wool cardigan, silver wire rim reading glasses on a chain across his chest. And he said, "I took it down." "And?" Walter said. Vernon told them. He told them the whole of it, in the slow, careful way of a man who has been telling stories at this same booth on this same Wednesday morning for the better part of 40 years. He told them about the rain. He told them about the kid behind the counter with the crooked name tag, the sandy blonde hair, the head thrown back mid-laugh, the $20 offer, the line about the wood. He told them about Dr. Hollis Ashby in his tweed coat with the brass loop on its chain, the cotton gloves, the small screwdriver, the way the curator had taken off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose for a long, quiet half a minute before he had said anything at all. He told them about the inscription on the inside of the buttplate. He told them about the serial number. He told them about Albin Carlson in the spring of 1917 and the master stalker who had finished 4 rifles a year. He told them about Lieutenant Colonel Frederick James Tull and the morning of the 7th of October, 1918. He told them about Captain Earl Pruitt and the letter. He told them what the curator had said about the auction range, between $72,000 and $95,000, and he told them, very quietly, that he had decided not to sell, and that Mara was going to drive down on the weekend, and they were going to talk about loaning it to the museum with his father's name on the placard. When he finished, Junior leaned back in the booth and let out a long, slow breath. Walter took off his reading glasses and folded them and laid them down on the formica beside his coffee. Becky came by and refilled all 3 mugs and went away again. The morning fog outside the front windows had begun to lift, very slowly, off the river. "Vern," Junior said after a long moment, "you ever wonder what that boy thought when the man in the tweed coat said the number out loud?" "Some," Vernon said. "I'd have paid money to see it," Junior said. "I'd have paid more than $20. And then the 3 of them laughed. They laughed the quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. They laughed the way men laugh when the joke is not on them anymore. The laughter rose up out of their 3 white coffee mugs and rolled across the formica and out the front windows of the Whistle Stop Diner into the lifting morning fog over the river, and Becky, who was wiping down the counter at the front of the diner, looked up and smiled to herself the way she always smiled when those 3 got going at the second booth from the door on a Wednesday morning. Vernon Whitaker took another sip of his coffee. He set the mug down. He looked out the window at the river, which was wide and gray and slow, and the same river his father had crossed in the spring of 1894 on the back of a milk wagon at the age of 3 weeks, swaddled in a square of muslin, and he thought, for the first time in a long time, that the world had, on this one small Tuesday afternoon in October, finally got around to seeing the thing his father had carried home from France for the rest of them to keep. A kid in a pawn shop lifted a presentation-grade Springfield Model 1903 out of a faded canvas case by the middle of the barrel and called it $20 worth of old wood. He didn't know. They never do. He didn't know that the small block letters on the underside of the stock were the initials of a dead lieutenant colonel from the 35th Infantry Division. He didn't know that the inscription on the inside of the buttplate was a quiet vow made in a billet outside Romain-sur-Montfaucon in the second week of October 1918. He didn't know that an old man in a faded John Deere cap had been carrying 107 years of his family's history in both hands, very gently, the way a man carries a sleeping cat, across the rain-wet parking lot of a small-town pawn shop on a Tuesday afternoon in the warm part of October. He didn't know any of it, but somewhere in him, after, he started to suspect. If this story reminded you that worth isn't always obvious, that the things that matter most rarely shout, that an old man in a faded cap carrying a long canvas case through the front door of a pawn shop is almost never carrying what a young man behind the counter thinks he is carrying. Subscribe to the Maker's Mark. We tell these stories because somebody has to, because the world is full of quiet old people carrying quiet old things, and not every one of them gets a Tuesday afternoon like Vernon Whitaker's. Because every maker leaves a mark.